So let's set about answering those good questions. This chart is from another textbook and it does a great job of summarizing the issues that we've talked about. So I encourage you to look at it carefully. And so one thing that this chart brings up is the idea of where do you locate your facilities to manufacture these goods. Let's talk about this a little bit in the context of the business strategy game. You've got two plants. You know that your Asia Pacific plant benefits from a labor cost advantage, but yet it's not quite as productive and it doesn't produce quite as high of quality. We also see that those location advantages sometimes afford us export advantages. So we know, for example, that you can import things into the United States uh, without any sort of import tariffs. But if you're in Asia Pacific, there are some relatively stiff import tariffs that you avoid if you manufacture in that country. So let's turn the page back a few years when Dell was at its booming best. One of their major PC manufacturers was in Ireland. Why Ireland? Because Ireland was considered or is a part of the European Union. Therefore, the computers that they were able to manufacture in Ireland, they could ship anywhere on the continent and not have to pay any import tariffs. And yet, at the same time, within the European Union, Ireland was a very low tax entity. And that's why you saw during the go-go early mid 2000s, Ireland was a booming country because a lot of people were taking advantage of that. The next question is this: what does the product mix look like? And so the textbook talks about an international strategy which has low requirement for adaptation, uh, lots of low orientations. I don't think it exists anymore. So I like to start with a global strategy. Global strategy is when you're trying to have a highly efficient operations and you're not trying to tailor your product much for the local environment. And you see companies that are like that. Boeing and Airbus are like that. They manufacture the same jetliner for use around the world. I told you that the US airlines had only bought 125 of the 1,000 or so 787s ordered, but it's the same 787. There's not a British version and a Japanese version. There are slight differences in the interiors, but the basic airplane is always the same. Software, I would contend, is largely like that. So Microsoft, when it makes a copy of Word, all those other languages are all built into that CD already. You just got to select them. So I think they sell a global product. Word is Word worldwide. It just has a few different languages built into it. What are the advantages of a global strategy? Because you're usually taking one manufacturing base and spreading the same product around the world, it can be very efficient. So you get a lot of economies of scale. What's the downside? Well, you are not making adaptations, so you may run into some demand problems where people are saying, this product is not quite right for what we are looking for. Notice too, when they talk about these strategies, they make an assumption of product mix and also the location of manufacturing. A global product, they say, is all manufactured in the same place. Well, take the 787. That's not true. The 787 is manufactured literally from Japan to Europe, and then it's assembled in the United States. So I don't think that's a good way to look at it, but you can see they're mixing two things at the same time, and that's okay. You just have to be conscious about what you're looking at. So the global strategy is one product for the world. The opposite extreme of that would be the multi-domestic strategy, which is to say we have lots of different products for lots of different places in the world. Let me give you some examples of that. Appliance manufacturers. Most appliance manufacturers have very different products for different markets. So if you're in Europe, you have to have 220, 50 hertz appliances. If you are in Japan, they're 110 volt, but 50 hertz. If you're also usually in Asia, your appliances have to be made very small because space and houses are at a premium. So an appliance manufacturer may have 3 or 4 different variants that they sell in the different markets based on the power requirements, the taste requirements, and the size availability in the homes, and they have to produce products. Another example of these are a lot of the customer-based products. So you'll often read about how some companies Procter & Gamble like have had success in some of the emerging markets by doing things like coming up with one serving packets of their product so that the people can afford to buy it one serving at a time as opposed to buy this big jug of Tide that costs them a month's salary. So those sorts of things are the multi-domestic. What are the issues there? Well, you can run into cost issues because you're trying to operate perhaps many different manufacturing plants, none of which have scale economies or all of which have switching costs involved as they produce one type of product and then another type of product and then another type of product, which they then have very specific logistics and shipment chains for. Of course, the advantage is you're delighting the customer. And to the extent that you're locating your production in their home country, that tends to be popular and helps being seen as a local company. And then you have the transnational, which is the Goldilocks solution, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And this is where you make some adaptations in your product, but there's a lot of similarities as well. And you do have some manufacturing spread across the world, but you're very conscious of your organizational strategy. An example of companies that are trying to pull this off now, and the book is really out on it, are automobile companies. Ford has been talking about their one world car platform. So they're trying to say, we want to build a basic car that's going to sell well in the United States, Europe, and Asia. And so the more similar they keep those cars, you can see the more they can drive their costs down and the simpler their manufacturing becomes. So they're trying to limit the amount of adaptation they do so as to cut research and development and production costs. The book's still out yet on whether they are going to be able to make the cars efficiently and yet sufficiently adapt them to local tastes to make them relevant. So then you have to ask yourself, what are some of the factors that are likely to drive which of these three strategies I go toward? That's something we're going to talk about in class. Organizationally, we're going to talk about how companies tend to do this when they go global in a couple of weeks in our organizational class. But suffice to say at this point that it creates real challenges for companies to figure out how to best organize. And then, let me back up for just a second. So, what strategy are you using in BSG? You should have said a global strategy, because if you think about it, you produce the same shoe and ship it around the world. At most, or at a minimum, for every factory, you are tending to ship to at least 2 regions. Some of you are shipping to all 4 regions from the same factory. So you're basically selling one shoe, although you could legitimately say I manufacture slightly different types of shoes in the 2 different factories. And some of you may build 3 and 4 factories. So you could shift to more of a multi-domestic approach. But right now, I would say in the beginning, all of you started with a global strategy. Now, what entry strategy are you using for your products in BSG? You're doing a basic exporting strategy. We control the manufacturing of it. We ship it to you. We pay tariffs. We put it in retailers. They sell it. That's your basic exporting strategy, which is the lowest risk and cost of entry and gives you a lot of control over the manufacturing of the product, but not necessarily a lot of control over the retailing of the product. And then you have licensing. This is where you allow somebody to use your name. What you in essence are doing is that in the private label market, where somebody's saying, hey, make my shoes, put my label on it, but I'm not having any control beyond that. So they're licensing their name to somebody to be used in perhaps their business model. And then similar to licensing is franchising. 7-Elevens are very popular in Japan, and yes, it is the 7-Eleven franchise model, adapted for Japanese tastes. Then you have strategic alliances. We've talked about those already, where you see that now we are taking a greater degree of investment risk, but by being in an alliance as opposed to exporting, I have a significantly more control because now they're an alliance partner where I can dictate a lot more of the terms. And then it says joint ventures, I would kind of put them together. And as I alluded to earlier, there were, for many years in China, for example, you had to launch into China, an outsider had to launch into China as a joint venture, and the Chinese company had to be a majority partner. In India today, it is still hard for the big box retailers to enter into the Indian market due to local and federal governmental restrictions that have forced them more to the joint venture where they are the junior partner. And then you have the wholly owned subsidiary where you're taking a lot of the risk, you're taking your plant and you're putting it in a new market to provide for that market. And you can see the little print on the slide. That would be, for example, the Toyota Tundra manufacturing in San Antonio, Texas. Toyota put that truck plant in San Antonio, and that was because it's warm there and they like Mexican food, right? No. Texas is the pickup truck capital of the world. You may not realize, all you Texans may not realize that, but there are more pickup trucks on the road here than there are anywhere in America. And so they wanted to put it in Texas, and you see that in the advertising. Built in Texans, for Texans. So they're trying to really get that local manufacturing edge. But these wholly owned subsidiaries are like, it all belongs to us, we got it, we plop down. And you're going to see these different strategies with these pros and cons among the different companies that we'll look at. But global has its own set of risks. You see this today. Political risk with rule of law and corruption. A lot of companies are running into problems in Russia, and to a lesser extent, well, I don't want to say to a lesser extent, to a different extent in China, as they feel like the playing field is not level. In Russia's case, there is just a lot of corruption and cronyism going on. In China's case, it's more just the political party push and the realization that you will always be at a disadvantage as an outsider versus an inside company. Economic risk, you're living this in BSG. You see the variations in currencies and how that affects your business model. And then you have the whole cultural issue of, am I going to be able to succeed in this culture? This is something you probably already had in the organizational behavior class, but I think it's important to look at it. Cultures vary, Hofstede says, on these 5 dimensions. So you take a country like the United States, where we have high individualism, relatively small or relatively short-term time orientation, a very egalitarian as opposed to a masculine environment, and go take that to China and negotiate, where consensus is important, long-term orientation, and uncertainty avoidance. They're very good at this. The Chinese are much more tolerant of uncertainty than many other Asian countries, but they're very good at using uncertainty with you in negotiations. They're very circular negotiators, which can make it very difficult for a Westerner to understand exactly what's going on in the negotiations. Administration, this is where you're just in a different system. And it's funny how it's working in reverse right now. As I'm making this video, there's a big discussion at a VW plant in Knoxville, Tennessee, in union representation. The way Volkswagen as a company does worker representation is based on the German model, and they're having real trouble adapting to that with the typical US style unions. So it's flipped around in that the United States is the one that's causing the problem, and you know in reverse it's happened many different ways. The geographic advantages, a lot of this has to do with the proximity and the regionalization, and economic, we've talked about that quite a bit already. So it's a real quick introduction into global, and you can see there's a lot of factors at play. Look forward to talking with you more in class.